March 23, 1945. South of Mainz, Germany. The Rhine is supposed to hold for one more night. At Allied headquarters, General Omar Bradley is bent over a map table, expecting the next great headline of the war to belong to Bernard Montgomery. Operation Plunder, the big British crossing in the north, is almost ready. The schedules are fixed. The plans are laid. The river is still there, broad and cold and final. Then the telephone rings. Bradley lifts the receiver. Patton's voice comes through the line, calm, almost pleased. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley straightens. Across what? The Rhine. For a second, the room goes still. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to WWII Warmind, like the video, and comment below with the WWII commander you want us to cover next. That phone call was not just a battlefield update, it was the moment an entire campaign changed shape. Because before dawn on March 23, George S. Patton had done what German commanders were counting on nobody doing so quickly. He had crossed Germany's last great western river barrier before the main Allied show even started. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand what the Rhine meant in March of 1945. The Rhine was not simply a river on the map. It was the final great defensive line in the West. Wide, fast, psychologically immense. German planners had lost cities, forests, bridges, and whole formations, but they still believed the Rhine could buy time. Maybe not victory anymore, but time. Time to regroup. Time to move reserves. Time to make the Allies pay dearly for every mile east of the river. And time was exactly what Patton refused to give them. What made Bradley go silent that morning was not only that Patton had crossed, it was when he had crossed, and how little warning he had given anyone outside his own circle. Bradley lowers the receiver and looks up at his staff. "Get me the latest report." Papers are rushed across the table. Situation maps are turned. Officers lean in. A colonel traces a finger south of Mainz. 5th Infantry Division, sir. 11th Infantry Regiment. Assault crossing launched last night. Bradley stares at the line. "That's impossible. Montgomery hasn't even started." The colonel answers quietly. "Apparently Patton has." Now the facts begin to pile up, and with each new fact, the impossible becomes harder to deny. On the evening of March 22nd, men of the 3rd Battalion moved down to the river near Nierstein at 21:45. Around 22:30, Company K shoved off in assault boats. Nearby, other elements crossed near Oppenheim. By 01:30 on the morning of March 23, both the 3rd Battalion and the 1st Battalion of the 11th Infantry were across the Rhine and roughly 5,500 meters inland on the east bank. This is not a patrol report, not a rumor, not a fleeting success that vanishes at daylight. This is a bridgehead. Bradley leans over the map again, and now he does what every serious commander does when confronted with something that should not have happened. He does the arithmetic, not just miles, not just hours. Sequence. Patton had to decide. Engineers had to move. Boats had to be gathered. Assault companies had to get down to the water in darkness. Men had to cross. The far bank had to be secured. Positions had to be organized. And all of that had happened before the larger, carefully prepared northern crossing had even begun. Bradley says, almost to himself, he beat the clock. That was the real shock. The Germans were not simply defending a river, they were defending a timetable. They expected the Rhine to impose delay all by itself. They expected a long, deliberate buildup. They expected the decisive crossing to arrive with noise, weight, and warning. What they got from Patton instead was speed, surprise, and a command style built around hitting opportunities before they could close. And here is the detail that makes the whole episode even more interesting. This was not literally some wild crossing launched with no authority at all. Eisenhower had already given Third Army the green light for an assault crossing on March 19. The issue was not basic permission. The issue was tempo. Patton moved so fast, and in such a way that he made the crossing feel like an act of battlefield theft. He stole time from the Germans, he stole narrative from Montgomery, and for a few extraordinary hours, he stole the future from the plan everyone thought they were watching. Later that morning, Bradley gets Patton back on the line. "George, how deep are you?" Patton answers immediately, "Deep enough to stay." That's not an answer, it's the only one that matters. Bradley's voice turns sharper. "You've got infantry east of the Rhine before your bridges are secure. If the Germans counterattack and cut those engineers to pieces, You'll have a disaster sitting on the far bank. Patton does not sound worried. Brad, there are so few krauts around there they don't know it yet. Not knowing it yet, Bradley says, is not the same as being unable to answer. Patton replies, then we'll stay ahead of their answer. That exchange captures the entire difference between the two men. Bradley is thinking in command responsibility, bridge security, counterattack risk, and the danger of overextension. Patton is thinking in momentum. He sees not the risk of being too far forward, but the greater risk of slowing down and allowing the enemy's mind to catch up with the battlefield. And on this day, Patton is not done. First, he wants the crossing quiet. He tells Bradley not to announce it. Keep it secret until we know the bridgehead will hold. That is the calculating Patton, the one who still understands surprise. But there is always another Patton waiting behind that one. Because as the day unfolds, the reports keep getting better. German resistance is lighter than expected. The foothold is growing. The assault boats have not led to a massacre or a collapse. More men are coming over. By 0945, Geinsheim has fallen, and more than 150 prisoners have already been taken there alone. Bradley reads the next report. Where are the German reserves? A staff officer answers, local resistance is weak and confused, sir. They expected something bigger. Perhaps somewhere else. Perhaps later. Bradley gives a tired half-smile. That sounds exactly like the kind of opening Patton lives for. Then the phone rings again. Bradley picks it up. This time, Patton is no longer secretive. This time he sounds almost jubilant. Brad, for God's sake tell the world we're across. Bradley says nothing at first. Patton continues, I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across. There it is. The other Patton. The public Patton. The competitive Patton. The man who did not merely want success, but wanted success witnessed, recorded, and set forever against the name of a rival. Bradley answers, this is not a horse race, George. Patton fires back. It is if history remembers who crossed first. And that line, whether you hear it as pride or as historical instinct, explains why this moment still carries so much force. Patton never thought only in terms of military movement. He thought in terms of military movement in memory. He understood that a river crossing could be more than an operation. It could be a verdict. But for the Germans, the real problem had nothing to do with ego. It had to do with time. A river defense lives on time. Time to spot the main effort. Time to shift artillery. Time to bring reserves. Time to hit the enemy while he is still vulnerable, while he is still half in the water, before engineers can turn a crossing into a corridor. Patton denied them that time. That is why German generals could not stop this crossing in 24 hours. Not because they failed to understand the Rhine mattered. Quite the opposite. They understood it perfectly. But they were solving the wrong version of the problem. They were expecting the river to delay the attack naturally. Patton treated the river not as an obstacle, but as a window. They were watching for a giant assault to announce itself. Patton crossed in darkness with assault boats and infantry before the grand northern operation ever opened. They expected to have time to react. By the time reaction became coherent, the bridgehead was already real. And that distinction changes everything. Because getting a few men across a river is one thing, holding them there is another. Expanding that foothold before the enemy can reduce it is the true measure of success. And all through March 23, that is what Patton's men and engineers accomplished. The hidden heroes of the story are the engineers. Infantry can seize a chance, but only bridging crews can turn that chance into something permanent. By late afternoon on March 23, a 40-ton treadway bridge had been completed. That meant vehicles, artillery, supplies, and the heavy weight of an army could begin to pass on to the east bank. The crossing was no longer balanced on rubber boats and small unit nerve. It was becoming a logistical fact. Bradley looks at the report and says, if traffic is moving, it's no longer a gamble. A colonel beside him nods. Then the Germans are already too late. Exactly. A crossing that is merely heroic can still die. A crossing that becomes logistical is much harder to uproot. And this is where the story broadens from one American general to the entire Allied command picture. Farther north, Montgomery is still preparing Operation Plunder, the meticulously planned assault crossing that was supposed to dominate the next day's war headlines. More weight, more artillery, more structure, more ceremony. It is the kind of operation staff officers admire because everything is in its place. But war has a habit of rewarding the man who moves before the other side understands what it is seeing. Some officers in Third Army later took considerable satisfaction in what happened next. A pre-recorded Churchill broadcast praising the British for carrying out the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history was aired unchanged, even though Patton's men had already crossed in the south. For a brief, delicious moment, prestige and reality moved on separate tracks. Somewhere in an Allied headquarters, a staff officer mutters, "Montgomery planned the speech. Patton took the river." That may sound petty, but it mattered. In coalition warfare, prestige is not a trivial thing. Prestige shapes influence. Influence shapes resources. Resources shape decisions. And Patton had just embarrassed the timeable of the better advertised crossing. But again, from the German side, the issue was even harsher. Imagine the reports arriving in sequence. First, possible movement near the river. Second, enemy boats crossing. Third, more troops landing. Fourth, inland positions being organized. Fifth, villages east of the river falling. Sixth, prisoners taken in numbers. Seventh, engineers bridging. That is the moment a commander stops asking, "Can we stop them at the water?" and starts asking, "How far inland do we have to contain this?" And by then, the defender is no longer shaping the battle. He is chasing it. That was the real defeat. Not merely that Americans crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim and Nierstein, but that they crossed it in a way that changed the question too fast. At Allied headquarters, the picture becomes clearer by the hour. A major points toward the roads leading beyond the bridgehead. "Sir, if they get onto that network cleanly, they're loose." Bradley answers, "Then the Germans aren't plugging a crossing anymore. They're trying to stop a penetration." That is the sentence that captures the transformation. A river battle had become an exploitation battle. Once that happens, the defending side loses more than ground. It loses the frame of the fight. And the numbers keep coming. By the end of the first full 24 hours, the bridgehead had expanded to more than 5 miles. Some summaries put Patton's forces about 6 miles beyond the Rhine, with very large numbers of German prisoners taken in short order. That is the point where even a rival must stop calling it reckless and start calling it decisive. Of course, Patton himself could never resist making the moment personal. Soon after, he crossed the Rhine in person. He paused on the bridge and relieved himself into the river he had wanted so badly to cross. Then, he stepped onto German soil, bent down, took earth into his hands, and declared, "Thus William the Conqueror." No one else in the Allied armies would have staged the moment quite like that. But no one else was George Patton. And still, for all the theater, one question remained unresolved. How would Eisenhower react? That is where most people expect this story to turn into a reprimand. The difficult commander moves too fast, embarrasses a rival, complicates coalition harmony, and gets brought sharply back into line by the supreme commander. But that is not what happened. Because Eisenhower understood something fundamental. Whatever else Patton had done, he had not crossed the Rhine into disaster. He had crossed it into success. And military history often belongs to the commander who can distinguish between behavior he dislikes and results he cannot deny. Bradley, reading through the latest messages, says to an officer nearby, "He's impossible." But right now, he's right. That captures the mood perfectly. Patton had not just gotten away with it. He had forced every higher commander to update his judgment based on the one currency that matters most in war: consequence. A commander who takes risks and fails becomes a warning. A commander who takes risks and cracks the enemy line becomes something much harder to dismiss. Then Eisenhower made his judgment official. On March 23, the same day the crossing became undeniable, he sent Patton a note. And this note is the payoff to the whole story, because it tells you exactly how the Supreme Commander saw what Third Army had done. He wrote, "I have frequently had occasion to state publicly my appreciation of the great accomplishments of this Allied force during the past 9 months. The purpose of this note is to express to you personally my deep appreciation of the splendid way in which you have conducted Third Army operations from the moment it entered battle last August 1. And then came the line that settled the matter. You have made your army a fighting force that is not excelled in effectiveness by any other of equal size in the world." That was the verdict. Not a rebuke. Not a warning about vanity. Not a reminder about coalition sensitivities. A verdict. Patton had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. He had done it before German commanders could mount an effective answer. He had done it fast enough to turn a daring crossing into a major rupture. And Eisenhower, who had to weigh risk against result, had looked at that outcome and concluded that Third Army had again done what it did best. That is what gives this episode its force even now. The setup feels familiar. Patton the difficult subordinate. Patton the showman. Patton the rival. Patton the general forever one step from causing command trouble. But the ending is not disciplinary. It is strategic. He did not merely survive his own audacity. He justified it. And in doing so, he exposed the essential weakness of the German position in March 1945. The Reich no longer had the margin to absorb surprise at that scale. The Rhine could still matter, but only if it bought time. Patton ensured that it did not. After the crossing, Third Army pushed deeper into Germany. Other Allied armies crossed in force. The Rhine, which had been imagined as the final great Western barrier, rapidly ceased to function as one. By late March, the road into the German heartland was opening fast, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany was no longer distant. It was approaching. But the human side of this story is what makes it memorable. Bradley thought in control, sequencing, and responsibility. Eisenhower thought in coalition warfare, balance, and total victory. Patton thought in momentum, opportunity, and memory. All three perspectives mattered. But only one of those men could make a river crossing feel like a command argument, a military coup, and a historical performance all at once. That was Patton's gift. And often, it was his burden to everyone above him. When people ask why Patton remains such a magnetic figure, this is one of the best answers. He did not simply move fast. He turned speed into a weapon against the enemy's understanding. He forced other commanders, friend and foe alike, to react to events he had already changed. The Germans needed time. Patton denied it. Montgomery needed the moment. Patton took it. Eisenhower needed results. Patton delivered them. And that is why German generals could not stop Patton's Rhine crossing in 24 hours. Because by the time they fully grasped what had happened at Oppenheim and Nierstein, the operation was no longer a vulnerable river assault. It was already an army in motion on the east bank of Germany's last great western river. If you want more untold World War II stories like this one, subscribe to WWII Warmind, like this video, and comment below with the next story you want covered.